Every year since I was a little kid, me and my family would set apart a weekend every fall, spend all our free time picking hops from our backyard hop plant. And so, in the picture that you can see here, that is our backyard hop plant. It's a lot of fun. We listen to music, get our hands dirty, and just spend quality time together picking our hops. So, you may be asking, why would I be picking hops with my family? And maybe even what are hops? Well, so I am James Sentis, and today I want to teach you about the beer making process and also the history of beer. And so, growing up, my dad has been a microbrewer for a long time, and so I have grown up learning about the beer making process and what goes into it. And throughout the time, I have learned that beer making is as much science as it is an art. And I hope to shed some of that knowledge onto you today through this presentation. So there are three main steps to in the beer making process. The first one is the creation and the boiling of the wort. The second is the fermentation process, and the third is the filtering and preparation stage. But before I get into the beer making process, I want to talk about the history of beer. So, beer has played an important role in human history in the throughout history. And so, in an article I read by Heartland Brewery, they said beer is the oldest recorded recipe in the world, and that's true. It originated with the Egyptians around 5000 BC. However, many historians believe that the idea and the use of fermentation dates back much farther to closer to 10,000 BC. However, uh, the modern day beer that we see today was most recently made around 1100 AD by German monks, who were the first people to ever incorporate hops into the beer making process. But other than those, beer has played a very important role in human history. An example of this is with the Middle Ages. Um, During the Middle Ages, people would often look to beer instead of to water because water could contain diseases or contaminants or toxins. While beer, because it is boiled and because of the nutrients that it has in it, it's healthy, and they knew that they wouldn't get sick from drinking it. And so many people look to beer instead of to water. And that's just one of the many times that beer has played an important role in human history. But let's move away from human history and onto the beer making process. So the first step in the beer making process is the creation of wort. And so you're probably asking, what is wort? Well, wort is smashed grains in a watery mix. And so the grains that are used are primarily wheat and barley, and they are mashed together because they are starch, but mashing them creates simple sugars out of them, and that can then be used by yeast in a later process that we'll learn about later. But why is wort important? As Food Republic said in an article, without fermentation, beer would simply be wort and nobody would want to drink it. So that pretty much means wort is the foundation of beer, and that wort provides all the nutrients and the flavor that beer has to offer. And so wort is very important in the creation of it, and it determines whether the beer will turn out well or not. And so at the wort stage, brewers will, after adding and mashing the grains to the water, they will then add further flavors such as fruits and hops to the mix. And because I was talking about hops earlier, picking hops with my family, I wanted to talk about more about what makes hops taste the way they do. So as you can see in this picture, this is what a hop would look like if it was cut in half. And as you can see, there's a yellow-ish powder that is like kind of coated on the inside of the leaves on a single hop. And so that powder is called lupulin, and that is what gives hops their flavor. And so when hops are used in the beer making process, that lupin will then leave the hop and kind of become part of that mixture of the wort that will later make or taste like beer. And so the interesting thing about lupin is that lupulin, sorry, is that many larger companies will actually, in fact, extract lupulin from the hops at an earlier time and then concentrate lupulin into little pellets that they will then put into the wort. Because then they do that because they don't want the organic matter of the leaves and the hop stem getting in the way and changing and affecting the taste of the overall beer. But many microbrewers, such as my dad, they do not extract the lupulin beforehand. They put in the whole hop, and from there, the lupulin will leave the hop and become one with the mixture. But after the addition of the hops and the fruits or whatever other spices they use to affect the flavor of the beer, the wort is then boiled, and the boiling has two main functions, and that is the first one is that it decontaminates the wort, and that it pretty much kills any bad bacteria that's in it. But then the second one is that it also brings together a lot of the flavors and the nutrients and allows it all to mix together. But after the wort is boiled, it is then cooled off. And at this point, we can move on to the second stage of the beer making process, which is fermentation. And this starts with yeast being added to the wort. But before I continue talking about fermentation further, I want to talk about what yeast is, because it's such an integral part of the of the beer making process. So yeast is a single-celled organism, but they live in multicellular colonies. And so this is a picture of yeast. And as you can see, there's many different grains. And each of those grains is actually a colony of multicellular or of single-celled yeast that live together in a colony. But that's what yeast looks like. And so yeast is added to wort. And from there, they will eat the sugar, the oxygen, and the nitrogen within the wort. And as they consume that, they will continue to repopulate. But they will then pretty much extract or release CO2 and ethanol. And that is alcohol within the beer, and then also the CO2, which is what makes beer bubbly. The cool thing about yeast is that there's actually multiple different types of yeast, and brewers will actually use combinations of yeast or different kinds of yeast depending on the flavor that they want to get out of the beer. But after the fermentation process is done and most of the sugar is transformed into alcohol, the brewers will then move on to stage 3 of the beer making process, which is the filtering, the preparing of the beer. And so at this stage, the brewers will extract all the organic material out of the beer, including the yeast. And the cool thing about this step is that the yeast is still alive after they extract it. And so the brewers can, in fact, reuse the yeast, or they can sell the yeast to a bread maker or somebody else that would use that yeast. But after they take out all the organic material out of the mix, they then add CO2 to the beer. This is because even though yeast create CO2 during the fermentation process, they don't create the amount that would cause it to be as bubbly as it is today in normal beer. And so many larger brands will infuse beer with further CO2 to make it even more bubbly, like we often see it today. But then after adding CO2 to the beer, depending on what type of beer you're making, brewers will actually have the beer sit in a cold like refrigerator for a period or a certain period of time. And so for lagers or for darker beers, brewers will actually have the beer sit for a long time in a cold refrigerator. While for ales or lighter beers, brewers will have them sit for a much shorter amount of time, or maybe not even have them sit at all. And so it pretty much goes that the darker the beer is, the longer brewers will have it sit for, and the lighter it is, the shorter they'll sit for. But that pretty much wraps up the beer making process. I hope I taught you a lot about or more about the history of beer with the human civilization and why it's an important part of human history. But I also hope I taught you more about the beer making process. I hope I taught you, or I hope I made you more excited about learning more about beer, and that the next time you encounter it, you can think of this presentation. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a great day.